There's a moment just before you wake up from a dream when you almost remember where you were. Not the images, not the story. Something deeper than that. A feeling like you've just come back from somewhere you've been before. Most people shake it off, roll over, let the day pull them forward, but some people can't shake it off because they've been to that place, fully, clinically dead. No pulse, no breath, and then returned. And what they brought back isn't just a near-death experience, it's a memory of choosing this life, this body, this family, this pain, this exact moment you're living right now. That's what a growing number of NDE survivors are saying, not in whispers, not at the margins of fringe spirituality, but in documented interviews, in research settings, under the careful attention of scientists and theologians who no longer know what to do with what they're hearing. They were shown something before they arrived, and they agreed to come. The stories don't begin where you'd expect. They don't begin in the hospital. They don't begin with the crash, or the cardiac arrest, or the operating table. They begin somewhere else entirely, in a place that, depending on who you ask, feels like home, more than anything here ever has. Dr. Raymond Moody, the researcher who first documented near-death experiences in his 1975 book Afterlife, collected hundreds of testimonies from people who had been declared clinically dead and then revived. He expected to find confusion, hallucination perhaps, distress. What he found instead was a pattern. Not identical experiences, but a shared architecture, light, peace, a sense of being seen fully and without judgment, and in many cases, a review. A kind of panoramic replay of the life lived so far, but it was what came after the life review that stopped him. Some of his subjects described a moment of choice, a threshold, a conversation, or something like a conversation, wordless but deeply understood, in which they were given an option: stay or return. And the return, they said, was not forced. It was agreed to, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with a purpose so clear it made the pain of waking up in a broken body feel almost bearable. For decades, these accounts were filed under anomalous experiences. They were acknowledged, catalogued, and quietly set aside. Researchers didn't know what to do with them. The medical establishment had no framework for conversations that happened when the brain, by all measurable criteria, was no longer functioning. But something shifted in the early 2000s. A cardiologist in the Netherlands named Pim van Lommel published a prospective study of 344 cardiac arrest survivors in the medical journal The Lancet. It was rigorous, it was peer-reviewed, and it confirmed what Moody's early work had suggested, that a significant percentage of people who are resuscitated after cardiac arrest report conscious experiences during the period when they were, medically speaking, dead. Van Lommel didn't try to explain it, he simply reported what he found, and what he found, buried in the data, in the testimonies, in the careful language of clinical documentation, was this: some of them remembered more than the experience itself. Some of them remembered what came before. Not before the cardiac arrest, before the life. There is a woman named Carol. She's in her late 60s now, retired, living in a small house in Oregon with 2 cats and a garden she tends every morning before the sun gets too high. She doesn't talk about what happened to her very often, not because she's ashamed of it, but because the words never quite fit. In 1987, she was 29 years old and 8 months pregnant when her heart stopped during an emergency C-section. She was gone for 4 minutes in which her daughter was pulled from her body, pale and not yet breathing, while the medical team worked on both of them at once. Carol came back. So did her daughter. And when Carol finally stabilized, when the sedation lifted and she opened her eyes to the fluorescent ceiling of the recovery room, the first thing she said to a nurse she had never met before was this: "I knew she was going to need me. That's why I came back. I was shown that. Before any of this. Before I was even her mother." The nurse wrote it down, not in the medical chart, in her personal journal, that night. Because she said she didn't know where else to put it. That journal entry is how this story survived. That journal entry is why we're here tonight. Because Carol's words point towards something that a growing number of NDE survivors are describing with striking consistency: a pre-life awareness, a moment experienced during the near-death state in which they didn't just see what lies beyond, they remembered what came before the beginning. And here is what makes that so difficult to simply dismiss. They're not describing a belief, they're describing a memory. Memory works differently than belief. Belief is something you build. You gather pieces, experiences, teachings, the things people you trust have told you, and you assemble them into a structure you can stand on. Memory arrives without assembly. It's just there, complete, with texture and weight and the specific gravity of something that actually happened. That's the distinction that researchers keep running into when they sit with NDE survivors who report pre-life awareness. The accounts don't carry the tentative quality of something imagined or hoped for. They carry the matter-of-fact certainty of someone describing a place they've been. A man named James, a former Marine now in his 50s, not someone who uses words like spiritual or cosmic, described his experience after a near-fatal drowning off the coast of Georgia in 2003. He was underwater for nearly 7 minutes. When they pulled him out, he was gone. When he came back, he was different, not fragile, not frightened, quieter. He told his wife, the night he came home from the hospital, that he'd seen something he couldn't explain. Not a tunnel, not a light, a conversation, not with God. He was careful to say that. Not with any figure he could name, with something he called a kind of knowing. In that knowing, he said, there was a map, not of the world, of his life. Before it happened, he described seeing his father, a man who had died when James was 11, not as a ghost or a vision, but as a presence that felt entirely real and entirely familiar, the way home feels familiar, even after years away. His father didn't speak, but something passed between them. An understanding. James was supposed to be here. He had been told why, shown why, agreed to why, and then forgotten. The way you forget a dream, the moment the day begins. The drowning didn't give him the memory. It removed whatever was covering it. That's how he described it. Not a revelation, a recovery of something he'd always known, underneath everything he'd been taught to think about himself and the world and what any of this means. James is not alone in that description. The language of recovery, of uncovering rather than discovering, appears across hundreds of documented NDE testimonies from every background, every age, every religious tradition and absence of tradition. A Catholic grandmother in New Mexico. a secular professor in Vermont, a teenager in rural Alabama who had never set foot inside a church, different people, different lives, different words, but underneath the words with the same shape, a life that was previewed, a self that agreed, a purpose that was shown, accepted, and then sealed behind the door of ordinary consciousness until something cracked that door open again. What strikes the researchers who study this most carefully is not just the consistency of the reports, it's the emotional residue they leave behind. People who return from NDEs describing pre-life awareness tend to carry a particular quality. It's not peace, exactly, though some describe peace. It's not certainty, though some describe that too. It's more like orientation. Like someone who has been lost for a very long time and has finally briefly glimpsed a landmark they recognize. They don't have all the answers, but they know which direction to face. Carol, back in Oregon with her garden and her cats, says she still doesn't fully understand what she was shown in those 4 minutes. She says she probably never will, not in this life, not with the mind she has now, but she says there's one thing she's never doubted. Not once in the 37 years since she came back, her daughter needed her to choose to return, and somewhere, before any of this began, she did. That choice left a mark, and the mark is still there. Which raises a question that James and Carol and every researcher who has spent serious time with these testimonies eventually arrives at, quietly, reluctantly, and with no easy way back from it, if you chose this life before you arrived. What did you know then that you've forgotten now? And is it possible that somewhere beneath the noise of everything you carry, you still know it? Here is where it gets difficult, because if these accounts are to be taken seriously, and a growing number of serious people are taking them seriously, then the idea of choosing a life before you arrive isn't simply a comforting thought. It's a shattering one. Because the survivors aren't describing a preview of the highlights, they're describing a preview of everything. A woman named Margaret, 62, a retired schoolteacher from Tennessee, had her near-death experience following a stroke in 2011. She was alone in her kitchen when it happened. She hit the floor and didn't move for over an hour before her neighbor, something pulling at her without reason, walked over and knocked on the door. Margaret survived, and in the weeks that followed, when the fog of the hospital finally lifted, she began to tell her daughter something she had no idea how to receive. She said she had been shown her life, not just the life she'd already lived, the whole arc, the losses she hadn't yet reached, the death of her husband, which hadn't happened yet, was there, in that place, lit and clear and present, like a page she'd already read. I saw it, she told her daughter quietly, the way you say something when you're not asking to be believed, only to be heard. I saw that he was going to go before me, and I saw that I had agreed to that, not here, not in this life, not with this mind, but somewhere. I said yes to it. Her daughter didn't know what to say. She wrote it down instead. 17 months later, Margaret's husband of 38 years died of pancreatic cancer. And Margaret, in her grief, which was real and full, and did not feel chosen in any ordinary sense, carried something beneath it that she still struggles to name. Not acceptance. Something older than acceptance. Something that felt, she said, like keeping a promise she had made before she understood what a promise costs. This is the part of the pre-life awareness accounts that doesn't get spoken about in the soft language of spiritual comfort. The survivors who remember choosing the hard parts too. The abandonment, the illness, the child who didn't make it, the marriage that broke, the years of quiet desperation that no one saw from the outside. They weren't spared those details in the preview. They were shown them, and they came anyway. That is either the most devastating thing you've ever considered, or it is the most profound. It depends entirely on what you believe a human life is for. If a life is meant to be pleasant, to accumulate comfort and avoid pain, then the idea of choosing suffering before birth is monstrous, an absurdity, a cruelty dressed in spiritual language. But if a life is something else entirely, if a life is a task undertaken by something far larger than the self that wakes up each morning and makes coffee and tries to get through the day, then suffering doesn't look the same, it doesn't feel the same. It becomes something you agreed to because you understood in a state of knowing that this mind can barely touch, that it was necessary, that it was yours, that it was in some sense that defies ordinary language. The point. Margaret tends her husband's grave now, every Sunday without fail. She brings wildflowers when they're in season. She says she still misses him the way you miss a part of yourself, the specific, irreplaceable way. But she also says something else, something she only shares with people she trusts, that in the grief, beneath it, underneath everything that aches, there is something that recognizes this, something that knew. And if that's true, if some part of you, the deepest, most ancient part, chose the weight you carry, then the weight means something. Every loss, every fracture, every night that went on too long, not punishment, not accident, agreement. That word lands differently depending on where you are in your life when you hear it. If you're in the middle of something that has broken you, it might land like an accusation. If you're on the other side of something that once seemed unsurvivable, it might land like a key. The survivors don't tell you which it will be for you. They only tell you what they saw, and what they saw was themselves. Choosing. Let's stay with that word for a moment, agreement, because it opens something that most of us spend our entire lives avoiding. If you chose this life, if there is some version of you that existed before this body, before this name, before the particular Tuesday you were born into a particular family in a particular city, then nothing about you is accidental. Not the family, not the country, not the era, not the wound you've been carrying since you were 7 years old, not the relationship that reshaped you in ways you still don't fully understand, not the loss that cracked something open that never quite closed again. All of it selected. And that is the question that NDE survivors who report pre-life awareness are quietly, persistently placing before the rest of us, not as theology, but as a lived report from the other side of death. What if none of this was random? Dr. Kenneth Ring, a psychologist who spent decades studying near-death experiences at the University of Connecticut, noted something that distinguished the pre-birth awareness accounts from other NDE elements. He described it as a pervasive sense that the universe is not indifferent, that there is design where we assumed chaos, and that the self participating in that design is far larger than the self that fits inside a human body. That phrase is worth sitting with. because it points at something the survivors keep circling in different words from different lives. Before you arrived, you were more than you are now. Not better, not worse, more. You had access to a perspective that this life, by design, requires you to forget. The forgetting, several survivors suggest, is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. You cannot fully inhabit a human life if you remember at every moment that you chose it. The grief would be too abstract. The love to knowing the whole experience would become something watched rather than lived. So the veil comes down, the map gets folded away somewhere you cannot reach, and you begin not knowing, which means every kindness you manage without knowing you agreed to be kind, every time you got back up without knowing you agreed to fall, every moment you chose love when nothing in your circumstances suggested you should, means something it couldn't mean if you remembered. That is what several survivors say was explained to them in the space between. The forgetting is what makes the living real. There is a man named David who has spent 20 years living inside that understanding. A contractor by trade, precise, practical, not drawn to questions he couldn't build an answer to, until a heart attack at 44 left him dead in a gas station parking lot, kept alive by a nurse who happened to be passing through. He came back, and in the months that followed, quietly, he began to grieve something he couldn't name. Not the attack, not the nearness of death. He was grieving the place he had left. It felt like being homesick, he said. Except the home wasn't a place, it was a state of knowing, and I'd been in it fully, completely. And then I was back here, and here felt thin, like a photograph of a room instead of the room itself. The thinness, he says, was the hardest part of returning. Not the surgery, not the months of rehabilitation, the return to not knowing. The return to a life that he now understood at some depth beneath language, some place this mind barely grazes. He had deliberately, freely, with full awareness of the cost, chosen, and could not remember why. And the question, the one you cannot unask once you've heard it said aloud, is this: if the forgetting is what makes the living real, then who are you right now in the life you don't remember choosing? Not the name, not the history, not the roles you've assembled like armor over a lifetime. Who is the one that agreed? That question has no answer you can think your way toward. It has to be felt, and some people only feel it once, at the edge of death, looking back at a life they suddenly recognize as something they once knew by heart. The accounts don't all look the same. That's important to say plainly, because one of the easiest ways to dismiss this body of testimony is to assume it must be identical. A single script replicated across thousands of minds, evidence of conditioning rather than genuine experience. But the accounts are not identical. They differ in imagery, in figures, in the specific emotional colouring of the experience. They differ in language and framing and cultural texture. What they share is structural, like different people describing the same building in different languages, from different angles at different times of day. The building is still there, and one of the most consistent structural elements appearing across cultures, continents, and decades of collected testimonies is what survivors call the briefing. Not an official term. It's the word David uses, a word others have reached for independently without knowing he'd used it. a preparation, a download as one younger survivor described it, before adding that the word felt entirely insufficient. In the briefing, survivors describe being shown not just what would happen in the life they were about to enter, they were shown what the life was for. A woman named Ellen, a teacher from outside Chicago who survived a severe allergic reaction in her early 30s, described being brought before something she called a council. Not angels, not gods, not anything her upbringing had given her language for. Presences, she said, vast and attentive and without judgment. And before those presences she was shown a series of moments. Not a movie, not a linear story. Moments, the way you might fan playing cards across a table, her mother's face at a particular age, a classroom she didn't recognize, a man she had not yet met, a decision point she couldn't see clearly, only that it was hers, and that it mattered, and that she had stood before it and said yes. Ellen came back and spent 3 years trying to locate the classroom she'd been shown. She found it by what she calls accident, though she no longer believes in accidents, when she applied for a teaching position 2 counties from where she'd grown up. She walked in for her interview and stopped in the doorway. She recognized it. Not vaguely, not approximately, exactly. The windows, the angle of the afternoon light, the way the ceiling met the far wall. She got the job. She taught there for 19 years. And she says that she never once walked into that room without the same feeling arriving quietly, the way something familiar does. Recognition, not déjà vu. Recognition. The specific, interior knowing of a place you chose before you forgot that you chose it. These moments appear with striking frequency in the accounts of NDE survivors who describe pre-life awareness, a house, a face, a landscape seen for the first time that feels inexplicably like return. Most people move through those moments and let them go. They don't have a frame for them. But the survivors don't let them go, because they know what those moments are. They're the map, surfacing, briefly, just enough to confirm what some quiet part of you has always suspected. You have been here before, not in a past life, in a preview, and some of what you've lived has already been recognized at some depth the conscious mind cannot reach, as exactly what you agreed to. The question that follows is quieter than the ones before it. It isn't about whether the briefing was real. It's about what you do with the moments you recognize. Because if the places and people that feel like return are points you previewed before you arrived, then your life is not a sequence of random events moving toward an unknown end. It is a terrain you have in some sense already walked, and the question is not where you're going, but whether you're paying attention to where you are. Ellen, now retired, says she still doesn't have clean answers. She's made her peace with that. She says the classroom was enough. Walking into a room she had been shown before she was shown anything, and knowing without needing to explain it that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not a map she could read, a feeling she could trust. But here is the part that stops people completely. Not the suffering you chose for yourself, the people. Because if you reviewed this life before you entered it, if you stood somewhere outside of time and saw the arc of what was coming, then you didn't just agree to the events, you agreed to the cast. The mother who couldn't give you what you needed, the father who left or stayed in all the wrong ways, the person who hurt you so completely, that you've spent years trying to build a self that can hold the weight of it. Several NDE survivors who describe pre-life awareness go to this place in their accounts, and they don't stay at the comfortable edges of it. They go all the way in. A man named Thomas, a pastor from rural Georgia, now in his early 70s, had his near-death experience in a car accident that killed his younger brother and left Thomas with injuries that took 2 years to recover from. He describes the guilt in the same breath as the experience. He doesn't separate them. Because in the space he entered during the accident, the place he calls simply the other side of the silence, he saw both. He saw the accident, and he saw a conversation that preceded it by what felt like an eternity and an instant at the same time. He and his brother as something other than what they were in the car that night, in a state of knowing he has no language for, choosing. Not just choosing to come here, choosing each other, choosing to meet at this precise crossroads where one of them would stay and one of them would go. We agreed, he says, and his voice doesn't break when he says it, which is somehow more devastating than if it did. I don't know what the reason was, but I know, in a way I can't unknow, that it wasn't random, that he chose to come with me as far as he could go, and I chose to be the one who had to carry it forward. Thomas has pastored his church for 40 years. He almost left after the accident. Not the faith, the role. Because how do you stand in front of people and speak about meaning when you are holding something that has no meaning you can hand to anyone else? He stayed. He says it was the knowing that kept him. Not comfort, not doctrine, not any theology he'd been trained in. The specific, unverifiable knowing that his brother had agreed, and that the agreement did not end with the accident, that it continued, that it continues still. This is where the pre-life awareness accounts become hardest to hold, not because they strain credibility, but because they strain the need for someone to blame. If the person who hurt you was part of what you agreed to, if the wound itself was in the briefing, then the clean narrative of victim and perpetrator becomes something far more complicated. That needs to be said carefully. Nothing about pre-life agreement removes accountability from the living. Nothing. The harm was real, the damage was real, but it does ask a different question. Not who did this to you, but what were you, at some depth beneath memory, hoping to learn from surviving it? Thomas doesn't offer an answer. He says the question itself is what he tends, the way you tend a fire, carefully, in the dark, so it doesn't go out. And here, with Carol and James and Margaret and Ellen and Thomas, each carrying something the rest of us can barely look at directly, something begins to take shape across all their stories, not a conclusion, a posture. They inhabit their lives, not consume them. To consume a life is to move through it, extracting what it gives you, the ease, the milestones, the moments that feel like reward. To inhabit a life is to move through it as if it means something you don't fully understand yet, as if even the damage was a doorway, as if the people who shaped you, in love or in harm, were participants in something far older than any of you. Something arranged, something agreed to, before you arrived. The survivors don't ask you to believe this. They only ask you to sit for a moment with the question, what would change if it were true? Everything that has been described so far, The briefings, the recognitions, the agreements, the weight of having chosen the very losses that have defined you, all of it points toward a single question the survivors circle, but rarely name directly, until you ask them plainly. And the ones who answer without flinching say the same thing in different words across different lives. They were shown what they came for, not in the abstract, not as a vague sense of purpose. Specifically, a woman named Ruth, 81 now, a retired architect from Philadelphia, died on an operating table in 1994 and was resuscitated after 11 minutes. She describes what happened with a clarity that has not faded in 30 years. She entered a space of light, and she's careful not to dramatize it. I won't tell you it was beautiful, she says, because beautiful is too small a word and the wrong kind of word. It felt accurate, the most accurate place I had ever been. In that place she was met, not by a figure she could describe physically, by a presence she recognized immediately, with a certainty that made every other certainty in her life feel like a rough draft. The presence didn't speak in words, but Ruth understood everything that passed between them, the way you understand your own name, without translation, without effort. What was communicated was this: she had come to build things that would outlast her. Not buildings, though she had built many. Structures of understanding. Frameworks that others would use to hold their lives together without knowing where the framework came from. She had chosen this mind, this century, this specific life, because it was precisely what the task required. And the task had been agreed to before she arrived. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and follow us every day. These are the accounts that don't make the news, and the only way to keep finding them is together. Now, stay with Ruth just a moment longer, because what she says next is the part that doesn't leave you. She asked, in whatever way asking works without language, whether she had done it, and the presence showed her something unexpected. A young architect in the Midwest who had found Ruth's work at 23 and built an entire career on a single principle from one of Ruth's papers, a principle Ruth had nearly cut from the final draft. That woman's work had sheltered thousands of people, and she had no idea where the idea had come from. I saw the whole chain, Ruth says, from me to her to them, and I understood, for the first time, that I hadn't been building buildings. I had been building a bridge, agreed to before I arrived, built in the dark, without knowing who would ever cross it. She pauses. That's what we all do, she says quietly. We build in the dark, without knowing who will find it. But someone does. Someone always does. Ruth went back to work 6 weeks later. She finished 3 more projects. She wrote 4 more papers, including the one that young architect would find at 23. She didn't know she was writing it for her. She only knew she had to write it, that the knowing was enough not to eliminate grief or doubt or the long ordinary days when the accurate place feels impossibly far away, but enough to keep building, in the dark, towards something that cannot yet be seen from here, but that was drawn up, agreed upon, and carried into this life in a place where she was more than she is now. And here is what I want to leave with you, not as a conclusion, but as a question you carry out the door. If you also built something in the dark, a kindness no one recorded, a sacrifice that disappeared into the ordinary, a word spoken at the right moment to the right person without knowing it mattered, Do you think you agreed to that too? Do you think someone crossed it? Do you think they found their way? I want to tell you where each of them is now, not because it wraps anything up, but because they're still here, still living the lives they don't remember choosing. Carol tends her garden in Oregon every morning before the heat comes. Her daughter is 40 now and calls on Sundays and doesn't know, has never been told, that her mother once stood at the edge of death and chose to come back specifically for her. Carol has never told her. She says some things are for carrying, not for sharing, that the agreement doesn't require a witness. James is still quiet, still precise. He builds things with his hands and says very little about what he knows. He told me once that the hardest part of coming back wasn't the adjustment, it was learning to love a thin world without resenting it for being thin. Margaret visits the grave every Sunday. She brings wildflowers when they're in season. She says grief and knowing can live in the same body, that one doesn't erase the other, that they have learned over the years to share the space. Ellen taught her last class in that classroom 3 years ago. On her final day, she stayed after the students left and sat alone in the afternoon light, the exact angle she had been shown before any of this began. And she didn't pray exactly. She just stayed. For a long time. In the room she had chosen. Thomas still tends his church, still carries his brother, still holds the question the way you hold a fire. Carefully, in the dark, so it doesn't go out. David still feels the thinness sometimes. He says it's less now. Not because the world has become more, but because he's learned to find the accuracy in the small things, the weight of wood in his hands, the cold of an early morning, the way his dog waits at the door. He says those things are real. He says real is enough. And Ruth died 2 years ago, peacefully at home, in the early morning when the light was accurate. Her family says she seemed in the last weeks like someone getting ready for a trip she'd been looking forward to for a very long time. She left behind 37 years of work. She left behind a young architect in the Midwest who still doesn't know where the idea came from. She left behind the bridge, and somewhere in the knowing that exists beneath memory, beneath language, beneath the forgetting that makes the living real, she left behind the answer to the question she asked in that accurate place 30 years ago. Did I do it? The answer is still traveling, crossing bridges built in the dark, finding its way to people who don't know they're being found. You don't have to believe any of this. You don't have to decide right now whether the life you're living was chosen or random, purposeful or accidental, a task or a chance. You only have to consider, just for a moment in the quiet after this ends, whether something in you already knows. Whether the recognition you felt in certain rooms, beside certain people, in certain unremarkable instants that somehow stayed with you far longer than they should have. Was the map surfacing just long enough to remind you, if this reached you tonight, if something in these accounts touched something you didn't expect, I'd ask you to do 3 things. Follow this channel so we can keep finding each other in the dark. Share this video with 5 people who carry questions like these, the ones who have always felt, quietly, that there is more to this than what the surface shows, and leave a comment, not to argue or to agree, just to say what it stirred. And if you have a story you think belongs here, or a question you've never been able to set down, tell us. We're listening. We're all, in our own way, still returning. There is a moment just before you wake up from a dream when you almost remember where you were. Most people shake it off, but you stayed with this tonight. You stayed all the way to here. And whatever brought you, whether it was grief or curiosity, or the quiet weight of a life that has asked more of you than you ever expected, something in you knew to look. That knowing is not nothing it never was.